Greetings! In this lesson, we will continue our skill development as it pertains to building bricks and plates. You'll recall that a brick is 4 point units high, while a plate is 1/3 that at 1.6 units high. The workflow is exactly the same. The height is the only difference. We're looking at a series of 2x4 plates here, and you can see these are the ones that we would use in an intermediary stack. We have our base version, our beveled version, and then our sub D1 or smooth once. We have a version with pegs. We would call this our base version, our beveled version, and then our sub D1. And then we have a version with the underside modeled. And we've got base, beveled, and sub D1. So that should be familiar to you. In this lesson, we'll begin with a review and we'll build some plates. And then in the second part of the video, we'll talk about alternative methods for building large size or odd sized bricks and plates. I'm going to go ahead and delete these. And you can import your peg start anytime you're building new bricks or plates. We can begin with the peg start, or you could begin with your 1x1 base. We're going to go ahead and review everything we've done up until this point. So you've got this peg start here. I'm going to quickly rebuild this just in hopes that this review will be helpful. I'm going to have my grid available. We'll open our cylinder. We'll come into the inputs. You'll recall that our subdivisions were 8 and our height was 0.8. We wanted to delete the bottom faces, and I believe we right-clicked and selected around. A quicker method probably is to just select all the faces and then with the control key draw a bounding box across the faces that you don't want selected. Always best to delete faces in the 4 view, just the wireframe view, so that you can see you have a clean selection. And we'll hit delete, 5 key, and we can see that the bottom side set of faces have been deleted. Now we'll jump into an orthographic front or side view. I'll hit the F key. And we're going to put the pivot at the bottom. You'll recall with the move tool selected, we're tapping the D key. We're now in reposition pivot mode. And we're going to touch that Y arrow. It was green, now it's yellow, which means we're constrained. And what the constraint means is that the X and the Z will not be affected. We're only going to be snapping on that Y position. And we want to snap to the bottom. So this vertex here, we'll hold down the V key and middle mouse button click, and that snaps up and remains perfectly centered because it was constrained on the Y. We'll tap the D key, and then we'll grid snap this up. Now it's sitting perfectly on the ground plane. We'll jump into the perspective view. I'm going to right click and choose edge, and we'll double click and select that bottom edge. So we have that bottom edge, the edge that's sitting on the ground plane. We'll come to the modeling toolkit and we're going to extrude that edge. We'll hit extrude and we're going to drive the local translate Z, and let's just manually type in 0.5. We'll jump into the top view. I'm going to click on the panel, tap that, hit the F key, and you'll recall that we're creating a 4x4 square. We'll right click, choose vertex. We'll grab a vertex, and with our move tool, we're going to grid snap, X key, middle mouse button. And I encourage you to snap, touch what you're snapping to rather than drag. If we go to drag, you might accidentally select one of the arrows. Now we're constrained on the Z. We'll click back in the middle. We see red and blue, and we want to be able to freely grid snap these. And because we're in the orthographic view, we're just limiting ourselves to the Z and the X. We're not inadvertently raising or lowering these vertices. All right, so we have our peg start, but if we were to hit the 3 key, we can see that when we ultimately subdivide this, this would be soft on the side. So we want to double click the top edge, shift double click the bottom edge. We'll hit the 4 key there. That is a clean selection. We'll come and we'll hit bevel. Our fraction is going to be 0.2 and our segments are going to be 2. And here is your peg start. We're going to, before we export it, if you hadn't already exported it, let's put the pivot at the bottom for this new shape, or make sure that it's there. It is at the bottom. We'll come to the channel box and we're going to zero this out. It's sitting on the ground plane, so we'll come to Modify, Freeze Transformations. Now anytime we want to get it back, we can just zero that out and it'll snap back to the origin, sitting perfectly on the ground plane. We want to get rid of our history, so in object mode we'll come to Edit, Delete by Type History, and then of course you could name this here. And we would export this if you hadn't already done that. File, Export Selection. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to save this one away, just put that on a layer. Let's build our 1x1 plate in this case. And this should be review, but I think it'll be helpful review. And at the end of this, we'll have a set of plates as well, which you will need for your upcoming builds. We'll create our cube. And we'll recall that this is 4x4, so we can just type that in here. 4 on the X, 4 on the Z, and then what was our height? You'll recall 1.6. If this was a brick, right, we would make that 4 units high, 4.8 units high, but it is a plate at 1.6. You'll also recall that we have to have the same number of vertices when we ultimately merge, so we'll open the inputs and we'll give ourselves an additional loop on the width, just type in a 2, and an additional loop on the depth. So now, if we look at these, let's hide the grid. We have the same number of edges. And we'll go ahead and we'll delete the top face. We'll hit the 4 key to make sure we've got a clean selection. You could have held down the control key to deselect. We'll hit delete, and then we want to put that pivot at the top. And we can go ahead and do this in the perspective view. In the last set of lessons, we jumped into the orthographic view just so that it was a little bit more clear. But once you get the hang of repositioning the pivot, you can reposition it if you've got a clean view in the perspective. So let's do that here. We'll tap the D key, right? We're in reposition pivot mode. We'll constrain ourselves in the Y, so we're going to pull that up, and we want it right on the top, even with one of these corner vertices here. We'll hold down the V key and middle mouse button click. You see that snapped down, and then we'll tap the D a second time to get out of that. And now we can grid snap this, and it is sitting perfectly with that peg. They have the same number of vertices, same number of edges, and so we can make a combine and merge. Recall that as we create this singular shape here, it is a two-step process. We want to combine the two meshes, and then we want to merge all the overlapping vertices. So we'll grab both shapes. You could do that here in the outliner. We'll come to the modeling toolkit and we'll hit combine. Now you'll recall from the first lesson that we have separate vertices here, right? Even though this is a singular shape, there is still a gap. So I'm undoing back. We're going to grab all of the vertices. And even though only the overlapping ones will be merged, we're just going to go ahead and grab everything to make it simple. And then we'll come to Edit Mesh, Merge. And we could pick one of those, or we'll pick the exact same one. And you can see now they have been merged or welded together. And here we would want to export this, right? So we would call this plate 1x1 base. We haven't beveled it, and we have not subdivided it. Now, just to review, why do we need to bevel the edge? Well, because when we do decide to subdivide it or render it in Arnold in the 3 mode as a preview or normal map overlay, we want to have those edges hard. So I'm going to duplicate this, and we'll just leave one on a separate layer here. I'm going to hide that away. You always want to label your layers, but just for the demo's sake, so you don't have to watch me type, I'm just going to leave that layer there. And you'll recall that we want to double click this edge, double click the bottom edge, and then we'll shift select the 4 corners. Hit the 4 key, and you can see that. Oops, I didn't get the bottom 4. So there we have a clean edge selection, all the areas that we want to remain hard when we subdivide. So we'll come to the modeling toolkit and we'll hit bevel. And on the 1x1s, our fraction is 0.1, or you could do 0.15. On the larger versions, it will be 2. And then our segments, regardless, are 2. we'll right click off, hit the 5 key, and now you can see when you hit the 3, when we subdivide preview, those edges remain hard. Let's go ahead and duplicate this, and we'll slide it over, and let's go ahead and subdivide it. Mesh smooth, and then we'll bring back that original box, and I'm in the wrong direction. Actually, let's move this on the Z. We'll just be looking down the Z. And so there are our 3 versions of a plate 1x1. Here's our base, here's our bevel, and here is our sub D1. Okay, in the next section of the video, we'll use the 1x1 base to create additional bricks, and then I'll show you some alternative methods. All right, we'll be right back. Welcome back. I should have cleaned these up before we exported. Let's just review that. I'm going to slide these out of the way, and we'll jump into the side view. I've got just my base here. We want that pivot at the bottom, so we'll tap the D key, move that up, hold down the V key, middle mouse button, click on that vertex, tap the D key. Then I'm going to grid snap this back to the exact center. And with this at the origin, we're going to freeze the transformation. So modify, freeze transformation. So now if we ever want to get it back to the origin, we can zero that out. We also want to delete the history. And let's just delete all of our history at once. We'll say edit, delete all by type history. And then we've got the pivot. We've got it frozen. And we've gotten rid of our inputs. And we would export this one as our plate 1x1 base. I'm going to slide that out of the way. And if you hadn't positioned the pivot on one of these, it's a little bit different in that we don't have a vertice at the corner, but we do have a vertice in the middle. So we would tap the D key, right? We're making that Y active, and instead of going to the corner, we're going to hold down the V key and snap there. Tap the D key. And if you'd done this before we beveled, you would have saved yourself this step. I failed to remind us. And then we'll grid snap this back to the origin. Right? We're going to just hold down the X key and get it back to the origin. We'll say modify, freeze transformations. Freeze transformations. So anytime we want to get it back to the origin, we can. History's already been deleted. So pivot at the bottom, frozen transformation, inputs have been deleted. We'll slide this guy out of the way, and we'll do the same for here. We'll tap the D key, move that up or down. Either way, we're just activating the Y. We don't have a corner here any longer because it's been beveled, but we do have a vertice right in the middle, so we'll V-snap to that, tap the D key, and then we'll grid snap this back to the origin, and we'll modify, freeze transformations. History's already been deleted. So the 3 of these have their pivots at the bottom, and they have had their transformations frozen, so that we can always get them back to the origin, and the history's been deleted. So these are the versions that we would want to export, just a little bit more clean. If you'd exported those others, just recall that when you import them, the pivot is not at the bottom. All right, let's continue. I'm going to go ahead and hide these. We'll hide those on a layer. You would want to label your layer. And then here we can see the convenience of just being able to type in a 0, get that back to the origin, and now we're in business. I'm going to model, right, we're typically modeling Z forward, so I'm going to make a duplicate and push it out in the X. Before we do that, actually, I'm going to make a recessed version. Let's have a recessed version of our 1x1. And if you didn't create recessed versions of your bricks, you could open up your brick 1x1 base and follow this exact same method. So I'm going to duplicate one of these and hide it, and then let's create our recessed bottom. We'll select the 4 faces on the bottom. We'll hit the 4 key to make sure that we've got a clean selection. And now in the modeling toolkit, we'll come and we'll hit extrude. And our offset is going to be 0.8, right? So we've pulled in 0.8, and we're going to extrude a second time. And you recall with our brick, we went up 4. In this case, we're just going to come up negative 0.8, right? Because this is 1.6, and so we're bringing it up half. And this might make a little more sense if we look in the orthographic side view, right? We have equidistance. So here is 0.8 here, and here is 0.8. 0.8 and 0.8 make that 1.6. So we have equidistance around, and we have a recessed here. And on our recessed versions, you typically, you could use this version, but we would typically want to bevel this, unless it was at a great distance, right? And you wanted to see that bottom recess. But I'll just review here, and when we recess, and especially when we create the internal cylinders, selecting the edges can be a challenge. So we'll hit the 4 key, and we can see we've got the top square and the bottom square. And let's select our 4 sets of squares first. We'll double click, and then on our terminal square, right, we have to shift double click around. So we've got our 4 squares. You can see those there, the top square, the top outside square, the bottom outside square, the bottom inner square, and then our recessed square at the top. We need our 4 outer corners. And then we need those diagonals, maybe a little bit easier to see in the wireframe. And then the 4 internal corners. So 3 sets of corners, or outer corner, inner corner, and then these diagonals. We'll hit the 4 key, and you can see that having that recess requires us to be a little more diligent in making our edge selections. And we'll hit bevel, and we'll recall that our fraction is 0.2, our segment is 2, and we'll right click, and we have our plate 1 by 1 beveled recessed. So this would be 1 by 1 beveled recess. And of course, you could duplicate that and come up to mesh smooth, and now we've got a subdivided version of that. And you want to check just to make sure you had a proper selection, and that looks good. All right, I'm going to hide these away, and we'll come back to our base. You can see why it's so important to have your base unbeveled version as a starting point for subsequent bricks. All right, I'm going to make sure that we're Z forward, and we'll push out a duplicate on the x-axis. So I'm going to delete the faces in this case on the negative x side. We'll hit the 4 key, and right, it's important to hit the 4 key to make sure you've got a clean selection, and I don't have a clean selection there. So I'll hold down the control key and draw a bounding box. And then we'll hit delete, hit the 5 key, you can see that there. We'll duplicate. I'm going to turn on my grid. Because the pivot's at the bottom, we can just continue to work in the perspective view. We'll grid snap this out. Hold down the J key with the rotate tool, and we'll rotate that 180 degrees. You could have also typed in 180 there. And then we'll grid snap it so that the two are touching, but the faces that would have been intersecting have been deleted. We'll select both with the shift key, or you can manually select here. Remember that when you're making a skip selection, it's the control key. We'll hit combine. We know that these vertices are on top of each other, but they have not been welded. So we'll just grab all of our vertices and come to Edit Mesh, Merge. And now if we wanted to check, we've got that there. All right, so let's get this prepped to export. We would tap the D key, middle mouse button snap to that vertice, tap the D key again, come to the channel box. It's already zeroed out, but we want to center it. So we'll come and grid snap that over. Right, now we'll freeze transformations. And we've got history here, so we'll delete it. And we'll just delete all of our history, delete all by type history. So here's our clean plate 1 by 2 base. It's positioned at the origin, frozen transformations, history is deleted, pivot at the bottom. This is where we want it to be able to save, and we can begin working out from here. Let me just do a recessed version of this, since you should know by now how to just bevel this version. But I will leave a version behind. I'll hide that away. And we'll grab these faces here. Want to hit the 4 key. Make sure you've got a clean selection. We'll come to the modeling toolkit and we will hit extrude. Our offset is 0.8, right? We extrude a second time, and our local translate Z is negative 0.8. So now we'll right click to, oops, now I moved that a little bit. I'm going to hit undo, right click to object mode. That's why it's important to get into object mode, just so that you don't accidentally touch something, which is what I inadvertently just did. So we immediately, once we were done, jump back into object mode. And then we want to bevel this. Why? Well, if you hit the 3 key, you can see that those, when we ultimately subdivide it, those edges would not remain hard. Quick review, right? We'll double click all the way around, shift double click. We'll select the diagonals and the corners. We got those 4 interior corners. We'll shift double click, shift double click, shift double click, shift double click. And we want the 4 exterior corners. Hit the 4 key, right? So we've got all the edges that we want to remain hard. And we'll hit bevel, and our values are 0.2, and our segments are 2. We'll right click to object and we'll hit the 5 key. And there we have it. Now, right, we want that pivot at the bottom, which it is, and we want it at the origin, which it is, because the original version had those done. And then we'll delete the history. And this one is ready to be exported. Plate 1x2 beveled. And then we could duplicate and smooth one, and we would call this plate 1x2 sub D1. Now you should be able to continue on, right? I'm going to go ahead and put these on a layer, and you can come back right to this one. We would duplicate this out, and we could create 4, 3, 8, any version of the bricks that we want. In the next section of the video, I'm going to show you some alternatives. So we'll be right back and talk about some alternative methods. Be right back. Welcome back. You'll recall that when we created our bricks during the last lesson, we created a 1x2, 2x2, and then 2x4. We didn't create a 2x3, but you should be able to deduce the workflow. We would simply delete faces on both sides of a copy. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create our 3, right? And we'll just delete the faces. So on this one, we'll delete these faces, hit the 4 key just to make sure, hit the delete key. We'll delete these inward facing faces, 4 key to make sure we have a clean selection. And then we'll grab the middle one, and we'll grab the faces on both sides. 4 key, right? We'll delete those. And we'll delete those, and we'll hit the 5 key. So we've got our 3 sections. Our pivot is at the bottom, so we can just work here on the grid in the perspective view. We'll pull that together, and there is our 2x3 plate. We of course need to combine it, and then we need to grab all the vertices and come to Edit Mesh, Merge, and now we have a 2x3 base. You could, right, fork in the road if you wanted to create that interior recess. Let's just do a quick review of that. Now here's an example of, selecting all of these faces would be a little bit of a chore. We can just select everything, and then let's jump into an orthographic view, Control key bounding box, and deselect. And then this leaves us with that bottom set of faces. You could have used the Shift key and selected around, but I think that's a quicker way of making that selection. We'll hit extrude, And our offset is 0.8. You could type that number in there. I've scrubbed up. We'll hit, we'll hit extrude a second time. And this is going to be negative 0.8. Right click to object mode. And here we've got a base with recess. But this would not be used very often, wouldn't be common usage. And let's just review making these selections, shift double clicking around. We want to really bevel this one. We'll do our rectangles first, shift selecting around. We've got that one, and then the interior, which will require 4 shift clicks. Now we'll do our corners, so let's start on the outside, get our 4 corners. We'll get our 4 diagonals. We'll just go in order, and then our 4 interior corners. We'll hit the 4 key, and we've got the 4 rectangles and the 3 sets of corners. We might say outer corner, inner corner, and then these diagonals. We'll hit bevel. Our fraction is 0.2, and our segments are 2. We'll hit the 5 key. There is our recessed beveled version, and then of course we can duplicate this, slide it over, mesh, smooth. And then again, before you export, we would just want these with their pivots at the bottom. So tap the D key, and we don't have a corner for this, so actually let's hide this one. Oops, come back to object mode, excuse me. We'll hide this on a layer, and I'll work on these one at a time. I didn't put the pivot at the bottom, but we can do that at any point. And in fact, as you're working, you'll oftentimes be changing the pivot. It's just nice to have it at the bottom as a starting point. But we'll tap the D key, and because we don't have a corner here, we're going to snap to this vertex. So we'll hold down the V key, middle mouse button, tap the D key. We'll grid snap it over. We'll get it into the origin. There it is. We'll say modify freeze transformations. We'll delete all of our history. And now we could save this one. So this is our plate 2x3 beveled. I'm going to hide that away. Bring this one back, same thing. We'll tap the D key, V key, middle mouse button, tap the D key. We'll grid snap it onto the ground plane. We'll grid snap it to the origin. Take a look at the top just to make sure that it's sitting at the origin. We'll say modify freeze transformations, and if you hadn't already deleted the history, delete the history. Now this is nice and clean. Sitting at the origin, pivot at the bottom, clean inputs, and we would export this. This would be 2x3 sub D1, and of course we're assuming that bevel. And this would probably be the common shape, and it has a recess, so we should say .r as well. So this would be 2x3 sub D1 recess. All right, so to that point, having built several versions of bricks, having built several versions of plates, you should be able to use this technique to create any size and any version, a base version, a beveled version, a subdivided version, and then those same 3 versions with a recessed underside. In the final part of the video, we'll talk about some alternatives. I'll be right back. Welcome back. The techniques that we used work well for smaller brick sizes, but if we have a brick or plate that's, for instance, this large, a 10 peg by 10 peg, then that technique would be too time consuming. So let me show you an alternative method. I'm going to go ahead and delete this one. We'll import our peg start import, and we're going to duplicate this 10 by 10. When we select it the first time and we hit Command D, or I'll do it the long way, edit, duplicate, we'll grid snap it over 4 units, and then we can just hit the Shift D. Shift D will repeat the last duplicate plus the transform. So I duplicated that, moved it, grid snapped it over 4 units, and then now we'll hit Shift D. So 3, 4, I'm hitting Shift D, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So now we've got 10 pegs fairly quickly, and we'll select all of them, and we're going to duplicate these. We're going to say Edit, Duplicate, or you could hit Command D. I'm going to jump into the top view. Now, if I were to just grid snap, you ought to know if I were to try to grid snap, all 10 of those grid snapped into the same exact place. I'm going to hit Undo. And so what we'll do is just tap the Z. So now we're grid snapping, but we're constrained to the Z. Another excellent example of the necessity of using constrained snapping. So with that active, the Z, which was blue, is now yellow, which means constrained. I can hold down the X key, and you can see we're moving all of those, but they're constrained on the Z. And now we can hit Shift D, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we very quickly got 10 by 10, and you could use this to create any sized. These larger ones are typically plates, and they come in many, many sizes. So you could create a great big ground plane of a plate. Let's combine these. You can see how many peg starts there are in our outliner. We'll select them all in object mode, and this is the same workflow. We'll hit Combine. All of those overlapping vertices are unwelded, so we'll select all the vertices. And you can see why drawing that bounding box is a lot easier than going around and trying to find the intersections. That would be incredibly time consuming. But our merge threshold is 0.01, so only the vertices that are sitting right on top of each other will be merged. And we can hit merge there, and we'll right click back to object. Let's go ahead and grid snap this back to the middle, back to the origin, and we'll delete the history. You can see how that's going to clean up our outliner there. Edit, delete by type history. And let's put the pivot at the bottom so we can raise it up. So we'll tap the D key, raise that up, and I'm just going to hold down the V key in my middle mouse button. I know there's a vertex there in the center. Tap the D key, and we'll grid snap this up. So this is now sitting on the ground plane right at the origin. Not super important that we zero this out, but we could. We can say Modify Freeze Transformations. So this is sitting at the origin. If I push down there, you can see that grid a little bit better. And now we'll create a large cube and we'll merge this to that. I'm going to create a layer just so that I can quickly hide this away. We'll create our cube, and if we count these, so it's 10, and we know that each one is 2 of these here, and we can hit the 4 key, so that's 4 units. So this would be 40. So we'll say X40 and Z40, and so you see that that fits there. We'll go ahead and hide that back. And then because it's a plate, it'll be 1.6. And then we need the number of inputs. So once again, if we bring this back, I'm going to slide this up just so that we can see that. How many do we need? Well, 2 times 10 would be 20, We need 2 for each of the pegs. We'll go ahead and hide that back. So in our inputs for this shape, I've reselected it in object mode. We'll say width 20 and depth 20. And so now we have the same number of edges, and we can make that attachment. Selecting these top set of faces could be a challenge, But we know the technique. We can just draw a bounding box around everything. And then in our side view or front view, we'll hold down the control key. I want the top set of faces, so I'm going to draw a bounding box with my control key around the bottom set. That leaves the top. I don't have the bottom any longer. I don't have the sides any longer. I control bounding box, deselected those, and now I can hit the delete key. Let's set this down, So the pivot is in the middle. We'll tap the D key. We want it at the bottom, so V key, middle mouse button. Tap the D key again. Oh, excuse me, we want this on the top. Excuse me, I was thinking of the other shape. Tap the D key. We want this at the top. V key, middle mouse button. Tap the D key, and then we'll grid snap this down so that it's at the origin. There is the ground plane. And I think I moved this up. And so now, right, with that pivot at the bottom, we'll grid snap this down. So these are sitting right on top of each other. Just as with our others, it's just a larger scale, but the workflow is the same. We're grabbing both in the modeling toolkit. We'll hit combine. And then we want to right click to vertex and we'll grab all of the vertices and we'll come to edit mesh, merge, edit mesh, merge. Now, you're going to have pegs that are close to you, so you're almost always going to subdivide these. And so you can see that we need to select the edge. We've got a challenge here in that if we just double click, shift double clicking all the way around, that would be cumbersome. So let's use that same technique of control deselecting. I'm going to select all of the edges. So I just right clicked, chose edge, and I've selected all of the edges. And in our orthographic views, we're going to deselect. Now, we'll get in here nice and tight. I'm going to hold the control key, and right, I want to deselect the diagonal. I want to deselect everything except that outer edge. So I'm getting up here, holding the control key, and drawing a bounding box, but I'm not coming past the external edges. So that deselected those. We can come back and you can see that those are, we've now very quickly got this outside edge without having to shift double click all the way around. And then we don't want to bevel these either, so we'll do the same technique. We'll jump into the orthographic view. We want the outer edge, but we want to get rid of these. So again, control key, bounding box selection, and we want to do it in the other view as well. Control key, bounding box selection to deselect. And now, very quickly, we've got this top square, the bottom square, and the edges. Now, rarely on a plate this large, these kinds of large plates are typically used for ground planes. But if you did have a large plate, right, before you did this, you could have created that recess, 0.8 offset, 0.8 translate Z. And then you would just have to make sure that you had those edges selected as well. Let's go ahead and bevel this one. And it is 0.2 and 2. And now we've got a nice large plate. We can hit 3. You can see that subdivide. Or we can just go ahead and execute the mesh smooth. And we have a nice ground plane. We'll turn off our wireframe on shaded, turn off our grid, and you can see that piece there. Let's do a quick review. We'll import our peg start, and let's just do, let's say a 2x8. Let's do a 2x8, which is a fairly common size. So again, Command D to duplicate, or I'll do it the long way, edit, duplicate, and we'll grid snap this out 4 units, and then I can use Shift D, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We'll grab all 8. We'll duplicate, edit, duplicate. Now I'm going to jump into the top view, and if we were to grid snap, right, they would, oops, excuse me, if we were to grid snap, they all 8 grid snapped into 1. I want to go in this negative X direction, so I'll tap on X. And now when I grid snap, oops, with that selected, now when I grid snap, they maintain their X position. They maintain their, their Z position and move only on the X. Now we'll select all 16. We'll hit combine. We'll right click and choose merge. We'll put that pivot at the bottom, tap the D key, activate the Y, V key, middle mouse button, tap the D key. Now in the top view, we'll center this, and then let's calculate the size of our cube, right? So if we know that this is 8, so 8 times 4 is 32. So let's create our cube, and that will be on the Z. We need 32, right? So you can see that that fits it there. And then we've got 4 and 4, so that would be 8. And we're going to create a plate, so this would be 1.6. So we have the proper size, and now we just need to get the subdivisions. I'll turn the wireframe back on and the grid. And so how many do we need, right? So there's 2 times 8, so that would be 16. And then, right, we would have 8 in this direction. Oh, excuse me, 4 in this direction. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2 times 4. So we'll type in 8. Oh, excuse me, 4. I'm sorry. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So now we have the proper number of subdivisions. You can review here. If you're making a 2 by 8, right, the scale of the cube is 8. On the x, the z is 32. This is the height of our plate at 1.6. Then our subdivisions, right, are half of that value, and the z, or depth, is half of that value. So easy to remember. And right, jot that down, and you can use this formula, if you will, to create any sized brick or plate. Now, we'll put the pivot at the top. So we'll tap the D key, activate the Y, V key, middle mouse button, tap the D key, and grid snap this up. We'll put the original peg on a layer and hide that away, and we'll use the technique that we were just introduced to. We'll grab all the faces, even though it's just the top faces that we want to delete. We'll jump into the side view, and then we'll draw a bounding box around the bottom part, leaving the top. We'll hit delete, and then we'll bring that back. We have our 2 meshes with the same number of edges. We'll bounding box select both, or you could shift select both. We'll hit combine. We'll grab all of the vertices, edit mesh, merge. And here is our base. But, right, we'll most likely be using these subdivided, so it's essential that we bevel. Now, once again, this is large enough, or maybe I'd say small enough to where you could shift double click around, but let's review that last technique. We're going to grab or select all of the edges, and then in the orthographic top view, we'll use the control key, and we're making a rectangle slightly smaller. We're not getting that outside edge. So I have control bounding box selected, and you can see that we've gotten rid of those edges. We'll do the same here, not from outside, but because we want that outermost edge. So just review that. Control bounding box select, got rid of those. And then we need these here in the front. So we've made a bounding box selection in each of the 3 orthographic views. And that leaves us with a clean selection of the edges we wanted. And again, on this one, you may have wanted, right, this is a shape where you might see the underside. Maybe this is part of a helicopter and it's going to be raising. You would just want to have recess those first. We'll hit bevel, and we'll hit 0.2 and segments 2. And there is a 2 by 8 created relatively quickly. And just remember that once you create it, you can export it, and you'll have it forever. Let's put our pivot where we want it, which should be at the bottom here. V, middle mouse button, tap the D, grid snap that up onto the ground plane. We'll come to the channel box. We'll say modify, freeze transformations. We'll delete all of our history, delete all by type history, and you could export this 2 by 8 beveled, and then you could export a version where we have subdivided it. All right, so that is all the techniques that you need for creating bricks and plates. The first video and the first 3/4 of this video, we used a technique of duplicating a base, deleting the interior faces, combining welding, and then deciding if we were going to recess before we beveled. Here, with the larger size, we used a slightly different technique where we duplicated out the pegs first, created a cube to fit with the same number of edges, then we merged and welded that. One little trick before we bevel, deselecting all the intermediary edges. So you may need to rewind and check that out. Yeah, questions in the tech discussion forum? Have a good one.